Hey everybody, this is a short piece titled The USSR and Nonlinear Capitalism. State capitalist theories of Stalinism do not rely on Tony Cliff by Martin Thomas. This is from Workers' Liberty 59. It's from, I believe, let me check real quick. It's from, 1999 or 2000. 1999 to 2000. The reason I'm reading this is that it's referenced in Marcel van der Linden's Western Marxism and the Soviet Union. So, that's why I'm reading it. For those who don't know, to my understanding, Third Camp Trotskyism, which Martin Thomas and Workers' Liberty is a part, historically has subscribed to the notion that the USSR was what they called bureaucratic collectivist. And I am getting the idea, based upon the last thing that I read, that Martin Thomas, within the confines of Third Camp Trotskyism, is questioning the bureaucratic collectivist thesis. Not to say that one or the other is right from my own perspective. I'm just reading the damn thing, but I think it's a very interesting discussion, and I'm not a Trotskyist or a Leninist myself, but I think a lot of the things that come out of Workers' Liberty and Third Camp Trotskyism in general seem to make a fair deal of sense to me, and I think are important contributions to political and theoretical discussions. So yeah, I'm just gonna start reading this thing. I got this from the Workers' Liberty website. I'm not reading the actual original issue, so hopefully you'll find it interesting. I'm sure I will. So let's get reading. Sean Montgamna's long article in Workers' Liberty 56 adds a lot to our understanding of Tony Cliff's doctrine of state capitalism in the USSR. Far from being the original or definitive theory of Stalinist state capitalism, as Socialist Workers' Party publicity would have us believe, Cliff's doctrine is a freakish variant having, quote, little in common with other state capitalist theories, end quote. Side note for me, I think this is true. I think this is a true observation that there are other people who have come up with the state capitalist thesis long before Tony Cliff, and there's no reason why he should be granted a special place among theorists of state capitalism. At least historically. End of my side note. It is an incoherent mix of neo-Trotskyist, quote, degenerated workers' state, end quote, bureaucratic collectivist ideas. In asides from his argument, however, Sean also claims that no state capitalist interpretation of Stalinism is possible, calling the Stalinist USSR state capitalist, Montgamna declares is as absurd as calling a marsupial a mammal. In scientific classification, marsupials are mammals, and so are some more apparently unlikely creatures, such as whales. The biological analogy proves nothing, but it does at least suggest that shortcutting the debate by an appeal to supposed sturdy common sense, quote, just look at this, it can't be capitalist / a mammal, end quote, is scientifically unsound. Sean concedes in a footnote that, quote, Trotsky's arguments against, quote, state capitalism, end quote, were never of the formal, quote, not enough market regulation, end quote, type, but always of a concrete and historical type, aiming to show that the Stalinist system is located in history somewhere radically different from capitalism, end quote. But then, in the very passage to which that footnote is attached, Shawn deploys exactly those same, quote, not enough market regulation, end quote, arguments. Quote, the USSR could not be analyzed as a giant firm, quote, firm, end quote, in the international capitalist market, not a self-regulating, but a, quote, planned, end quote, economy. The idea that bracket Maoist China, end bracket, was an economically regulated system and not one of overwhelming totalitarian state power crazily out of control cannot be sustained, ... end quote. Trotsky considered the Soviet Union certainly a market economy. Not a free market economy, of course, but a market economy. Only messed up by the Stalinist delusions about the ability of administrative decrees to replace market mechanisms. He rejected the equation of Stalinism with state capitalism not because Stalinism had, quote, not enough market, end quote, but because, as he wrote in The Revolution Betrayed, because he believed that the USSR's economy was progressive and capitalist statism reactionary. If we reject the idea that Stalin's more total statism represented economic progress, as Trotsky himself came close to doing in the course of the 1930s, and if we also reject a picture of capitalism as being at an absolute dead end economically, as we must, then all Trotsky's arguments against describing the Stalinist USSR as state capitalist fall to the ground. Max Shachtman, the finest of the writers working in Trotsky's tradition after Leon Davidovich's death, took a different view. What Trotsky took to be the Stalinist delusions, Shachtman took to be reality. What Trotsky took to be the hard underlying reality, Shachtman considered a pretense or facade. There was no market in the Soviet Union. Shachtman never argued this issue out, as far as I'm aware, or even mentioned the difference between his view and Trotsky's. But I guess Shachtman's thinking here is connected with the fact that as late as 1961, he was repeating Trotsky's assessment of capitalism as being in hopeless decline. To call the USSR, quote, state capitalist, end quote, would imply the conclusion, impossible in Shachtman's eyes, that capitalism might have a whole new phase of economic advance beyond it. If he called it, quote, bureaucratic collectivist, end quote, with the proviso that this was a unique hybrid system that avoided such implications. Despite all the later anathemas against Shachtman by the orthodox, quote, neo-Trotskyists, end quote, his arguments against state capitalism were reprised almost exactly by the most influential of those orthodox, Ernest Mandel. Via Shachtman, Mandel, and all their colleagues and followers, the idea that capitalism equals market, Stalinism equals non-market, became fixed in all neo-Trotskyist discourse, but I believe it is false. There are radical differences between, quote, ordinary, end quote, capitalism and Stalinism, but they do not consist in, quote, ordinary, end quote, capitalism being market regulated and Stalinism lacking all regulation beyond political whim. Capitalism is never self-regulating. Sometimes it operates under, quote, overwhelming totalitarian state power crazily out of control, end quote. Not just Stalinism, but also the Nazis and many third world despots, more often under more moderate state regulation. Alongside that regulation, markets are economic regulators within limits. Conversely, the Stalinist economies were often extremely resistant to political will. They could not function without markets, extensive, quote, black and, quote, gray markets, but also extensive official markets, and extensive use of world markets by the bureaucrats to guide their administrative price setting. In the early 1930s, Stalin's regime seriously talked about replacing wages by state rations, but it never did, and it never snuffed out market forces. Workers in the USSR and in most other Eastern Bloc countries moved from job to job seeking the best bargain. Employers bid for the best workers and with bonuses and perks and tried to squeeze productivity out of their workers with piece rates. When the workers mobilized, wage rises were among their first demands. Often the mobilization was sparked by price rises, sometimes by uncontrolled inflation. The class struggle between workers and bosses on both sides demonstrated that the wage bargain was a real economic factor, just a formal facade for political allocation of work and food, clothing, and shelter. The Stalinist economies were state capitalists because they were based on wage labor. It was wage labor coupled with extreme political coercion. As Bukharin pointed out in analyzing it as a theoretical possibility, quote, state capitalist structure of society makes the workers formally bonded to the imperialist state, end quote. But as the system developed and matured, the political coercion did not gradually become the dominant form of surplus extraction, with wage labor more and more vestigial. The opposite happened. The system drifted more and more towards, quote, ordinary, end quote, wage labor. It did that because the wage labor and the states that exploited wage labor were embedded in and competed within the capitalist era of world economy. As the terrible political torsion on the economies of the USSR and Eastern Europe, and to some degree China, has unwound, the economic substructure revealed has been not, quote, collectivist, end quote, but capitalist. When the, quote, bureaucratic, end quote, twist to supposed, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, unwinds, the spontaneous outcome is not collectivism but capitalism. Sean might reply that I am ignoring a, quote, transformation of quantity into quality, end quote. Even if there is a continuous spectrum from USA capitalism to USSR economy, that does not prove that the USSR was capitalist any more than the existence of a continuous spectrum from red to violet proves that violet is red. But the bedrock difference between, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, and, quote, state capitalism, end quote, in the whole long historical debate remains this, quote, state capitalist, end quote, means capitalist, quote, bureaucratic collectivist, end quote, means something beyond capitalism. By now the evidence is clear. The Eastern Bloc systems were not post-capitalist. It is not true that they were generated because economic development needed state planning, and they satisfied that need, albeit in a bureaucratic and bungled way. Heavy state intervention has proved necessary for economic development in less industrial countries. The totalitarian planning which distinguishes the Stalinist states certainly has not. It has no clear economic advantage over the milder forms of state capitalism which have dominated everywhere else in the less industrial world. The Stalinist systems also did not represent a higher or ultimate stage of capitalism. They were limited episodes within the epoch of capitalism and characteristically in underdeveloped countries. To my mind, a, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, which is deemed not post-capitalist, is no, quote, bureaucratic collectivism at all. quote, new superior relations of production never replaced older ones before the material conditions for their existence have matured within the framework of the old society, end quote. So wrote Marx in the preface to the Critique of Political Economy. Certainly we need to avoid summary and mechanical interpretations of this terse phrase. Avoiding mechanical interpretations is one thing. Quite another is the idea that a, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, can emerge as a whole new mode of production, rather than as a distinctive politico-economic regime of capitalism from within capitalism without being post-capitalist, without representing a qualitative step forward from capitalism for at least the decisive social classes involved. A whole new mode of production does not spring up, least of all out of capitalism, the most dynamic, flexible, adaptable, and mutable mode of production yet in history in the period of its greatest flowering, just because this or that political group desires it. To put a label, quote, bureaucratic collectivist, end quote, on the Stalinist bureaucracy's clashes with private capitalism does not clarify the contrast, but only restates it. Why do they clash with private capitalism? Because they are bureaucratic collectivists. Why are they bureaucratic collectivists? Because they clash with private capitalism. The argument is circular. Moreover, the, quote, bureaucratic collectivist, end quote, designation can seem to clarify the contrast between Stalinist economies and, quote, ordinary, end quote, capitalism only for those who confine their analysis to the two polar cases typified by the USA and the USSR, and leave most modern economies in a comfortable blur. If the state economies of the Eastern Bloc were anti-capitalist, then inescapably the state sectors of Mexico, Algeria, Iraq, and many other countries were too, and their state bureaucracies were anti-capitalist, quote, bureaucratic collectivist, end quote, classes. Even in Mexico, the, quote, bureaucratic collectivist, end quote, class, if that is what it is, was visibly more powerful than the private capitalist class. Analyses, incontrovertible in their own terms, have been written to show that pre-1982 Mexico, or Israel in the era of solid labor histadrut domination, were, quote, bureaucratic collectivist, end quote. The foremost writer of the, quote, bureaucratic collectivist, end quote, current, Hal Draper, arrived as well known at the idea that not only Stalinism, but also social democracy and all other forms of non-Marxian socialism were incipiently bureaucratic collectivist. Quote, socialism from above, end quote. The world shows not, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, on one side, and, quote, capitalism, end quote, on the other, but a spectrum of different mixes between, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, and capitalism. The USSR was not very much like the USA, but if we define capitalism as, quote, like the bracket modern, end bracket USA, end quote, then even disregarding Stalinism, we will have to recognize that the 500 years of the capitalist era have included many forms of quasi-capitalism that certainly fall within that era, but have not been much, quote, like the USA, end quote. Capitalism in colonial and ex-colonial countries, for example. We will need a new word X for, quote, capitalism or quasi-capitalism, end quote, or, quote, a variable mix of bureaucratic collectivism and capitalism, end quote. The problem of analyzing the specificity of the Stalinist states, precisely what sort of X were they, what is its historical relation to other forms of X, is not clarified but obscured by adopting the label, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote. Set aside the labels and look at the historic facts. The conflicts of the Stalinist or, quote, statist, end quote, political autocracies with private capitalists in the less industrialized countries have been not anti-capitalist, but nationalist. The state bureaucracies in less industrialized economies have originated from the petty bourgeoisie, and generally from more or less closely knit military formations drawn from the petty bourgeoisie. Those petty bourgeois rebelled against the parasitism, corruption, and dependence of the old oligarchies or colonial administrations in their countries. They wanted national development. They made bourgeois revolutions or semi-revolutions against the bourgeois oligarchies and their allies, feudalistic landowners and colonial rulers. Depending how tightly knit and ideologically coherent their organization was, they pushed the old oligarchies aside, reduced them to second rank, or crushed them. The petty bourgeois revolutionaries or reformers mobilized on the basis of bourgeois measures like land reform and national independence. But they did not want bourgeois democracy and free enterprise, which will allow the old oligarchs and imperialists still to hold considerable sway. In all cases, they created powerful interventionist states where there were vigorous, fervent, mass mobilizing revolutionary Stalinists. They created totalitarian regimes, austerely dedicated to national industrial development, protected by military discipline against disruptions by individual profiteers or by the working class. In such cases, the liberated peasants were re-enslaved, this time to the profit of the state rather than private landowners. Not merely the larger part, but the whole of surplus value was ruthlessly concentrated in the hands of the state and channeled into crash industrialization. The state sectors developed large-scale national capitalism, not anti-capitalism. Sometimes the state has consciously worked to foster an indigenous private capitalist class. Sometimes it has been tightly committed to allowing no competitors, thus cementing many specificities. The elimination of most of the bourgeois civilization that would normally accompany capitalist development, unmanageable economic biases towards chronic shortages, cycles of overinvestment, stifled inflation, inadequate scrapping, and top-heavy industry, and so on. It has never broken out of the historical ambit of capitalism. Much cited in the debate about the nature of the USSR is the true idea that the development of class societies is more complex than a straight linear sequence. Slavery, feudalism, capitalism, socialism. Necessary also, I think, is the equally true idea that the development of capitalism is not just a straight linear sequence. Capitalism can run on different tracks, in parallel, in different sectors of the world. It can backtrack. It can develop in, quote, inorganic, end quote, forms. In the era of, quote, classical Marxism, end quote, before Stalinism, Marxists were not afraid to discuss different forms of capitalism: monopoly capitalism, finance capitalism, imperialism, state capitalism. With Stalinism, all that discussion came to a dead halt. The standard Marxist scheme remains, quote, competitive capitalism, monopoly capitalism, socialism, end quote. Even the early theorists of state capitalism in the USSR remained trapped by that scheme, feeling that they had to, quote, locate, end quote, the USSR as the most monopolized, most advanced end of the, quote, monopoly capitalist, end quote, section of the sequence. Even if you set all the Stalinist states aside, not all capitalist societies can be located along that linear sequence. We need a more complex, multi-track picture of the development of capitalism, and that, I think, can provide the understanding of the specificity of Stalinism. Quote, capitalism without bourgeois civilization, end quote. You might call it. Which, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, for all its verbal extremism, cannot give. There are serious, probably irreparable difficulties with the one sustained attempt made so far by Marxist writers to develop a, quote, multi-track, end quote, understanding of capitalism. The Regulation School of Michel Aglietta, Alain Lipietz, Robert Boyer, Bernard Chavance, and others. It is highly significant, however, I think, that the attempt alone has led all these writers to categorize the Stalinist states either as capitalist or some sort of quasi-capitalism, and has produced such rich and detailed analyses of the specific economic patterns of Stalinist economy, very different from those of Western capitalism, as Jacques Sapir's Economic Fluctuations in the USSR. Thanks for listening.